the industry's out there working. Scouts really dig finding a new player to add to their list. They want exciting talent on their list to select. I think we've gotten better about finding those guys a little bit earlier. Certainly, the advent of social media has helped that a great deal. And at that point, you hope you have good, talented, thoughtful scouts that understand that now there's a whole process that has to get run in relatively short order. So if you are that player that popped up, it's going to seem like hard and fast. You're going to have a lot of teams reaching out. They're going to have a lot of questions. That's okay. Embrace it. It's still a pretty fun process. I understand it's stressful, but we're going to find you eventually.
What is up, Advocate Podcast family? I'm your host, Matt Hannaford, and today's episode, we are talking all about scouting. As a quick aside, if you haven't done so already and listened to my prior episode with the West Coast Crosschecker for the Tigers, Alex McClure, you should go ahead and check that out as well. But today's episode is with the National Crosschecker for the New York Yankees. His name is Mike Wagner. With over a decade of experience in scouting and player evaluation, Mike has become an integral part of the Yankees' success in identifying top talent in the draft. His journey in baseball began as a player at Vanderbilt, where he balanced the challenges of college athletics with academic excellence, earning degrees in economics and mathematics, and later added an MBA from Cornell to his already impressive resume. From his early days with the Rangers and the Mariners to his role as an area scout with the Blue Jays, Mike's career has been defined by a relentless pursuit of excellence in the game of baseball. Since 2014, he has been with the New York Yankees, where he now oversees the player evaluation of top prospects across the country, and he plays a critical role in shaping the team's draft strategy. In today's episode, Mike gives us a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes for a player to succeed in the ultra-competitive career of baseball. We're going to discuss the traits that make players stand out. We talk about the keys to navigating the path leading up to the MLB draft, and how technology and analytics are transforming how teams are evaluating players and scouting players today. Whether you are a player, a parent, or someone eager to learn about baseball scouting, this conversation is packed with insights that you have not heard before. Join me today as we explore these fascinating topics with my guest, Mike Wagner.
All right, so I'm joined today by not only what I would call a friend, but somebody who I admire and have known for, Wags, how long has it been now? Are we going on like...
It's been since at least the Austin Riley draft in 2015.
I think you're right. Funny how when you represent a player like Austin Riley, that scouts want to talk to you more.
Sure. It'll happen.
I think that just comes along with it. But no, man, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. I guess what I'd like to kind of start with is, Wags, did you when you were, you played baseball at Vanderbilt, obviously you went to Cornell after that. And as I look at your, what I'd call kind of your resume and really what your studies were, did you always have an ambition of wanting to be, call it in the front office in scouting? Is that kind of always been your goal?
Yeah, for sure. I was really drawn to scouting. I had a chance to intern in the Mariners front office and be a part at a very administrative level in Seattle in 2009, the draft. And literally as simple as like getting magnets up on the board, helping out in the draft room with administrative needs. I was like, this is a cool environment. There is some impact here. That year in Seattle was the Dustin Ackley draft. And then we had multiple picks. So it was a huge workout at Safeco Field at the time, now T-Mobile, in Seattle. And you saw these guys running through the ballpark with some talent. Hey, there's some real decisions that have to be made. I got a small peek behind the curtain right after I got done playing. I was like, yeah, this is something I want to get into. The front office part is attractive, strictly because as you stay in the industry longer and longer, you want more and more impact and as close to the major league team at some point as you can get it. With that being said, the amateur scouting side is a blast. You're around a lot of good people. You get to see a lot of baseball. You get to impact a lot of lives. And I've enjoyed the heck out of it.
Well, I would say scouts for me are kind of the lifeblood of this game. And I think a lot of times scouts don't get the credit they deserve. And I've even told this to scouts right before the draft. It's like, man, this is like D-Day for you, because you're about to find out if all of the work that you just put in for this last year is going to like end up and reward you or not, right? Like you could driven however many miles and spend however many hours watching kids play, and then your organization doesn't take any of them. And I can only imagine how frustrating that could be. But all the while, all these scouts, they don't complain about it. It's just on to the next year. So I've always admired scouts for that.
The thankless part of the job is what it is. It typically is worth it when you get to text a guy after he gets called up to the major leagues, or give him a call and be one of those first, 5 or 6 people in his life that get to congratulate him on a lifelong dream. So yeah, you're not going to get everybody. That's the nature of the draft. And
Right.
on the other side of it, the players and the agent need to do exactly what they can to get the guy taken off the board, either as high as they can go or by the right team, whatever it ends up being. And you understand that's the game we signed up for.
Right. So as you guys, and I guess I'm talking for the parent, let's just say, who really has no insight into the draft at all, right? Their kids are going to some of these perfect game events. They see colleges there, they see scouts there. How early will you guys start scouting a particular class? Is it the summer before? Is it even before that? What would you say as far as how early you guys start?
So you start getting some name familiarity coming off of, typically the first kids I hear about the earliest are coming off of that like 15U national team. And it's not scouting at that point. It's quite literally just checking the roster. Where are these kids from? Is there a chance I'm going to bump into one of them while seeing a prospect that's available in this year's draft? Their rising junior summer is where we start hearing the names with a little bit more frequency. They start showing up at some of the big events, whether that be the PDP is, the underclass guys that might make the 18 and under national team. You start getting into names, but really the scouting process begins at the cross-check level right after the draft and in the summer leading up to the draft with the July draft date. But the area scouts will start bringing these guys to workouts and to hit groups, as early as sophomores in high school. They may not make it all the way up to the National Crosschecker scouting director level, but yeah, they're starting to get scouted. I would say more so than anything is once you are in that loop going into your senior year, we start working backwards a little bit. We're going to call coaches you played for in the past. We're going to talk to, somebody that might have been your teacher 2 or 3 years previous and start getting an idea. So while you may not be actively scouted as a sophomore, there are plenty of times where things guys have done at 15 and 16 year olds that we've had to go back and ask some tougher questions about.
Yeah, and you're ultimately, correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to learn as much as you possibly can about the player, because if you guys are going to invest and have this guy wear your uniform, you want to know a lot of stuff. How is he going to deal with adversity? How is he going to deal, with this game when it punches him in the mouth, right? He deals with some failure at AA. Is he going to just cower or is he going to punch back? So it's funny. I interviewed Dallas Braden for the podcast, and we talked about that exact thing where it's, he was speaking with so much passion, and you could hear it in his voice that like, this is actually what got him to the big leagues. Somebody who was a 24th round draft pick. It was this fire and this belief in himself and really this fearlessness that ultimately is what led him to be successful. If you don't have the chance to talk to him and ask him questions beforehand, and you're just going off of what you see on the mound, that guy may never get drafted.
Sure.
So
100%. Getting to know the player is an integral part of the process, strictly because when we walk into the yard, typically we're there because the guy already has talent. We know there is some minimum talent threshold that they've already jumped over. At that point, obviously, there's levels to the talent, but inside of your talent band, there has to be separators. And typically it comes with, how do you handle yourself off the field? How do you conduct your work to get ready? Do you treat your body in a way that lets you get better year over year? Do you treat people well enough that you attract the right type of attention, the right type of coaching? Those are all things that, get classified under makeup in our work, but they're an important part of it. And it all gets discussed at one point or another in the draft year process.
So you mentioned makeup. Can you give us an idea of, because in my understanding, and I've heard scouts talk about this, there's kind of like an on-field makeup and then an off-the-field makeup. Can you give us the difference between the two?
Sure. Let's start with the on field, which, depending on who you ask, maybe the most important part of it. Do you have this Dallas Braden unwavering belief in yourself? While as a team sport, it's super individualized. When you step in the box against Dallas Braden, it's very much, mano a mano. You better believe you can get Dallas Braden and barrel a fastball in or stay on that changeup long enough to drive it in the outfield gap. So how well do you compete? How confident are you? How much of a risk taker are you? Do you believe you can make a play that other guys wouldn't even attempt? So those kind of classify as on-field makeup, that like risk-taking, aggressiveness, kind of hard nose, and the mental side of it, like really believing in yourself. Off-field is typically, how do you allow yourself to get better when a baseball's not in your hand? Do you surround yourself with other highly motivated people? Do you hold yourself accountable? Typically, it always comes back to an accountability piece, right? Nobody's around. It's 7 a.m. It's in the off season. Did you get up and go to the gym today? Did you get swings in? Did you take care of your body? When you and your buddies went out to eat, did you choose something more often than not that was going to fuel you in the right way? Or did you just like immediately jump for the burger and fries? Guys have varying levels of personal accountability, and the really good ones, they always come with like, oh man, he's crazy. He does X, Y, and Z. Well, that's the crazy we're kind of looking for off the field. A guy that'll hold himself accountable no matter what the situation is. So that's typically how I separate them.
So I think sometimes kids think that they need to be perfect when working with scouts, when dealing with scouts, when interacting with scouts. And I've tried to remind these players, whether it's guys that I advise or just anybody I run into through a meeting or whatever, these scouts are going to see you so many times that over time, like there's no fooling anybody into, you getting taken in the first round, right? You're not going to trick somebody into getting paid a lot of money. They're going to ultimately see you enough, get to know you enough, talk to you enough to realize really what you are. But do you guys oftentimes see players who maybe you're like, oh, is this an act? Like, is that something that you can like read?
I mean, in our meter for that is pretty high. We get lied to quite a bit just by the nature of the job. It's okay to be yourself. It's okay to be a touch different. It's okay to be a little brash if that's your personality. We're going to find out eventually. I'd rather you just get comfortable in your own skin. So typically when I'm, meeting with a player, if there's a chance that we have a mutual connection, somebody we know, talk about that. I really do want to get to know who the person is. Our scouts with the Yankees really do want to get to know what the person is. And within 5 days of being in player development, our guys in the minor leagues will know regardless. So, we get fewer touch points. Those guys get to be with them all day, but you're not going to trick our organization long term. That's not going to happen. So go ahead and be yourself. And if that means you're a little bit quiet and it means you're a little bit more reserved in conversations, fine, no problem. Plenty of guys that play in the major leagues that are like that. If you're really outgoing and it's a loud glove and it's your wristband and chained up, then so be it. Like, let your personality hang out. Like, it's going to be unique guys that show up on TV anyways. Don't worry about showing who you really are. We're going to deal with all kinds of people throughout the year.
Yeah, so I interviewed Alex McClure for the podcast, and he actually brought up something interesting. He says, look, it's on me, the scout. If for some reason a kid is unique and different, and it's a turnoff to me, and this kid turns out to be Francisco Lindor, like how dumb do I look that I crossed him off my list because, well, yeah, his hair was too long, or, he gave me a different answer than a normal kid would give me. Like, that's on me, the scout. So if anything, I want to make sure that I keep everybody in the mix as long as possible and intentionally not eliminate anybody, regardless of whether their personality is a little different or if they're not like every other kid. And I feel like that was such an important point because I do believe that and look, I think that what these kids and these parents are trying to do is just present their best self, right? And so naturally it can be overwhelming and they could get a little nervous, like, oh, is this what they wanted to hear? Is this what they want for their organization? And so naturally, if you are different, you may feel like that's a bad thing. So that's actually a great point you made, and I'm glad that you did.
No, it's certainly on us. The ideas of crossing guys off, hey, we have to make decisions at some point. Crossing guys off early in the process is typically like a no-no. There's only so much talent out there. Usually it just leads to another question. It's not a no. It just leads to one more question, one more person we may have to talk to. But different is not bad. If you've walked around a major league clubhouse or met a major leaguer, and obviously you have, Matt, but for anybody listening to this, there's all different types of personalities. And there's guys you'd like to hang out with, there's guys you wouldn't like to hang out with, but they're all wired well enough to be in the big leagues and try and stick.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the levels of scouting. So you have obviously, the area scout, you have kind of the regional crosschecker, national crosschecker, scouting director, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the different emphasis that each level has and like maybe what their focus is a little bit?
I mean, first and foremost, everybody's job is talent evaluation. We all have different amounts of responsibility based on background information, training information, and that's really where the area scout level differentiates itself because they're typically going to have the best relationships with the pitching coach at a college or know the high school baseball coach or the local travel coach that somebody plays for. They're going to obviously have the first layer of evaluation where they tell you how good a player is and then start to create kind of a background profile. How does this kid tick? What drives him? What motivates him? Why did he choose his college commitment? How do you feel about not playing shortstop his freshman year of college and playing second and waiting his turn? That type of information is typically dug up at the area scout level because they get primary source information. They can get it right from the kid. They can get it right from the coach. The regional cross checkers are typically supervising 4 or 5 area scouts and going around that region, really digging into what type of talent do we need to keep moving towards our first round pick. This is as the players start moving up the board. And they may say, hey, this is, I might get a call or Damon Oppenheimer or Mitch Coulihan, our assistant. Hey, we need to start talking about this in the first round or the second round. And that's really when it starts getting into our orbit is like top 3 rounds where when we make our schedules, we're working off the area scouts recommendation and the regional cross checkers recommendation of, hey, we need to talk about this player first, second, third round. And certainly the way the schedule works out, you mix that in with, 4th, 5th, 6th round guys that you end up really liking and digging into as well. But that's how our schedule is going to get made at the national cross-check scouting director level. But we all have relationships. There's times where I've reached out to a college coach because I had the area and they were at Mississippi State and then they moved on to a different university. And now I have the best relationship. So the background piece of it can come from anybody, but typically the area scouts own that and do a really good job. And they understand that part of the process is vital.
So naturally, the area scouts, obviously, I would say maybe more present, more consistently going to the games, right, for some of these kids. So if we're strictly talking about a guy that's being considered in, let's just say, the top first, second, even third round on some level, how often is that guy being seen by the regional guy and the national guy?
Quite a bit. For the regional cross checker, that's typically going to be a 2, 3, 4 look type player. If it's a college guy, it might be a second weekend that they spend with that type of player. The national cross checkers are going to try and get multiple looks on those guys. Some of it depends when we get the information that guy's going to be in play for those rounds, but we're all going to try and get multiple looks at talent at the very top of the draft. It's where the majority of the money gets spent. It is where the majority of, the success and criticism can happen is up there. So you want to be really thorough at every level, certainly on day one in the first 2 rounds.
And as far as the calendar goes, so, the spring season starts. Is there an emphasis early on, like, all right, let's go see high school kids early and then get college looks? Is it specific like that? Is it not like that at all? In your experience, how does it typically go?
It probably depends on the team a little bit. We have a huge emphasis on making sure that we scout the player when they're ready to be scouted. When I was kind of prepping for this, one of the questions you had sent over to think about was misconceptions of scouting. And I think one of the bigger ones is that we're there to like slash dreams and say no. We're showing up to the yard excited, want to like players, and post draft. I mean, we're some of the biggest cheerleaders these players have, and we understand how cool it is that what we do is a very small part in helping a kid live out his 5-year-old dream. It's one of the few industries where a 5-year-old doesn't have to give up on his dream at 25. It's still going on. And we take that pretty seriously. So, I guess when I think about the calendar, we really need to see guys when they're ready to be scouted, when they can show the best, because you don't want to be holding to a bad look. If I'm sitting there and holding on to some look and we scouted a player when he wasn't ready, we could have effectively taken ourselves out of a really good player. And that's not good for me. That's not good for the Yankees. That's not good for the player. That's one less team that's involved in potentially selecting that guy. It also tries to keep us on players a little bit longer. And the area scouts drive quite a bit of that. Hey, I just saw this guy. He's coming off a basketball or football season. He's not quite ready to be seen yet. He needs a few more at bats. Great. We'll push him out 2 weeks. No problem. If it means we got to scout him 3 or 4 games in a row, let's do it. I'd rather see him in his peak form and have a real idea of what we can draft than see him in non-peak form and have essentially wasted a day. Because in order to see him in peak form, I got to come back. I'd rather that second or third look really be a decision of like, how much do we like this guy? Where do we want to take him? How much do we want to pay him?
Right. So this question that I'm going to ask you right now is really it's an important one. It's funny. It's in a sense I'm almost asking this not for me to know the answer, but for you to tell everybody on this podcast something that I want them to hear, right? And so
Sure.
the question that I'll ask you is, other than the player that's being taken first overall, at what point are these teams actually figuring out who they're taking in the draft?
We build a board like everybody else, and you have an idea of what grouping of player you're going to get your hands on in round one. And the group gets a little bit larger of who you think you're going to have a chance to take in round two. And certainly you can get surprised, and a player can get to you that you didn't think would. But typically, while we may not know the name, we know the group of 4, 5, 6 names that could typically be there. And we have those players ranked and ordered appropriately. And for every round, it gets a little bit bigger. Depending on how you set up your draft board in the room, you might know, hey, around this part of the draft, we might get 2 or 3 of these guys. So let's be ready. Let's make sure we know who the agent is. Let's make sure we know the kid well enough. Make sure all the background information is cleaned up, because this part of the draft, maybe we do really well in. And we know that these players we've ranked a little bit higher than other teams. We're going to pick a few guys out of this. So instead of knowing specific players all the time, you really know like a bracket of players on your board. You're like, I think we're going to get one from there, maybe 2 or 3 from here. If we do a great job and we get lucky, we get 4 out of this. And now we're into the 6th round, and we're pretty fired up at that point about how the draft's going.
Yeah, so you guys start to put that board together. This isn't months before. Like, you're scouting guys, hey, these guys are better than others. But when that thing really starts to take shape and the list gets, the grouping of guys starts to get put together, I mean, we're talking leading up to the draft.
Yeah, the board build is typically a couple-week process leading up to the draft, and you try and push it as long as possible to avoid anchoring bias.
Mm-hmm.
You think this guy's up here and this guy's down here, and if you rank it too early, they don't end up getting close enough to be compared, and you're really trying hard to make sure that you don't fall into that trap of, I didn't compare Johnny to Jimmy, and gosh, Johnny ended up being better than Jimmy, and we never even gave him a chance to be ahead of him because we ranked it too early and didn't let it play out. That's as dangerous as anything. So trying to eliminate that early ranking bias as much as possible.
All right. So my next question, and I'm going to ask you this, and I'm not asking specifically about, I'm going to talk about the model, right? Like draft models. I'm not asking specifically about what your guys' model looks like, but can you give the listener a general sense of like, what is a model? Because I think that term gets thrown around so much now with the draft. And I think there's some confusion, and a lot of families don't really understand what that is.
Typically, it's a weighted average algorithm. You're going to sit there and come up with a formula based on how they've performed, what their tools are, maybe their age, where they are relative to their class, and it's going to spit out a number. I'm keeping this super simple, but it's going to spit out a number, a score that allows you to start getting ranked. And there's any number of factors. There can be physical projection built into that. There can be delivery assessments or swing assessments, depending on the team. Age can play a bigger or smaller role. And these are all inputs into a math equation. And on the other side, a score shoots out, and then they get ranked. But somebody is choosing the weights of the tools, the performance, what gets weighted more or less on the front end, and it's spitting out a ranking on the other side. So some teams use it and are really firm with their model rank, and they believe they've built a really good math equation. And some people don't use it at all. Some people use some type of mix. Some people use it as a checks and balance against the draft board they're building. But it's a big math equation with a bunch of inputs. The inputs are different from team to team, but yeah, they're used in varying capacity across Major League Baseball.
Yeah, and I think on some level it makes a ton of sense to me because, I've been doing this over 20 years, and back in the day, you would always hear these stories like the St. Louis Cardinals are having a workout right before the draft. So and so goes to the workout, has a bad round or a handful of bad rounds of BP, and like he goes from being a guy being considered in the first round and he falls all the way to, let's just say, the third, right? And so many of these teams were aware that, like, well, that's not good, right? We don't want to be led to believe this guy he had a bad day, should be a guy that is no longer that first round guy for us. So one of the things I do like about kind of the model idea is this model should ultimately prevent those instances from happening. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a wonderful body of work. What are they? What have they done? Tool. I think there's arguments to be made about how good it is at predicting the future, but I do think it gives you a very strong baseline of what kind of capacity have they filled to now, and are they hitting the ball hard now? Have they been hitting the ball hard for a while? Is it recent? All of those things can be weighted in a model. So you can get this really nice picture of who a player is today and relative to their peers. I mean, they're all getting scored on the same baseline, which is incredibly useful because we all come in with varying levels of bias. It is at least one tool that hopefully has less bias baked into it.
All right. So talk a little bit about maybe somebody who doesn't live in Southern California, Texas, Florida, Atlanta, a big city. Let's just say they live in Wyoming, and they haven't,
Sure.
a high school kid, hasn't been to a bunch of perfect game events, but is a really talented player, and he pops up late, right? Every year there's a guy that
Sure.
pops up late. Is that player being negatively affected because he didn't go to some of these tournaments? Or do you believe that if he's good enough that the industry as a whole will generally find that player and scout that player?
I would say it would be very atypical for the player to be negatively affected, other than they just haven't been scouted enough. Now there are some benefits to that, right? Not all your hickeys are going to show for a shorter period of time. But yeah, the industry's out there working. Scouts really dig finding a new player to add to their list. They want exciting talent on their list to select. I think we've gotten better about finding those guys a little bit earlier. Certainly, the advent of social media has helped that a great deal. Somebody with a camera phone can upload a video to X or to Instagram. They tag, it gets retweeted, and I don't know a scout out there that isn't sitting there like, hey, shuffling through that, and wow, there's a guy out in Pascagoula that's throwing 95. Let's check on that. That seems interesting. We don't have a lot of those guys, certainly not there. And we go scout the players. And at that point, you hope you have good, talented, thoughtful scouts that understand that now there's a whole process that has to get run in relatively short order. I'm going to have to meet with this kid. I'm going to have to meet with his parents. I'm going to have to talk to some coaches and find out who he works out with. And the process just gets condensed. It can feel really intense for those players. So if you are that player that popped up, yeah, it's gonna seem like hard and fast. You're gonna have a lot of teams reaching out. They're gonna have a lot of questions. Some of them are gonna be redundant because it's not known information because you hadn't been on the circuit. That's okay. Embrace it. It's still a pretty fun process. I understand it's stressful, but we're gonna find you eventually. You'll pop up at a junior college the following year. There's going to be a junior college showcase or a junior college tournament that fall, and it'll come hot and heavy then. It may not always happen right out of high school. If you're talented, it will happen. There's too many good scouts out there, too many people that know coaches for it to go on for too long.
What are your thoughts on players or parents feeling like they should only play baseball? Maybe they start to specialize, let's just say, as a freshman in high school. I mean, as a scout, do you like when guys play multiple sports, assuming like, if a kid's going to play basketball or football, is that something that you guys would actually go watch him play another sport just to see how he performs or interacts?
Absolutely. I would, if you have the capacity to go play other sports and you like playing other sports and you're 16, 17, 18 years old, yeah, you should be enjoying high school and playing high school sports with your friends and enjoying that experience. If your goal is 100%, I want to sign out of high school, and you're a good self-evaluator and you know there's a lot more work that needs to be done in order for that to happen, then yeah, you may have to make that choice of specialization because baseball is a skill sport. You have to acquire those skills and reps and time. But by and large, it's a huge bonus for us when a guy can be good enough for us to be in the ballpark scouting them, and we know that they've had to dedicate time to another sport and they can do it at a high level. It's always more interesting when they're also good at that sport because it's transferable athleticism. If you say you played football and you rode the bench for 4 years, it's not nearly as interesting as a guy who trotted out at wide receiver and caught 800 yards receiving and 7 touchdowns. But yeah, be a high school kid, play sports if you have the capacity to do so. The only time I think specialization is like super warranted is if you're like, hey, I really got to close some skill gaps. And this is really what I want to do.
Yeah, I think the majority of kids that I've come across that play multiple sports, I think have been good at, and I'll just use the one that I have in mind and I won't tell you the name, but this kid played football and baseball, was actually really good at football. But if you looked at like his future, this guy had the chance to be a top kid in the draft. He wasn't going to go to the SEC and play quarterback. Like he could have gone to a D2 and played quarterback maybe. But for him, it was like, okay, so should I play my senior year, or is the risk of being injured big enough for me to not do that? But that's one of those things, like I recognize the concern about being injured, right? But I love what you said about like, is there a skill gap? Because if you're, as you said, like going to play football and not really play, and then you could be devoting this time to maybe hitting or throwing or, building your strength or whatever, like that makes perfect sense. So I think you bring up a lot of good points. And I think people today are hearing this a lot more because I think for a long time, so many people thought, no, we need to specialize as early as possible. And, I totally disagree with that. I mean, I think you probably played multiple sports. I played multiple sports until I was a junior in high school.
Yep. I played football, basketball, and baseball in high
Right.
school. I didn't drop basketball until my junior year when it was like, okay, baseball's starting to get serious and there's some things I need to get better at. And I was pretty skinny as a 16-year-old kid. So I need to devote some more time to the weight room. But I played football all the way through. I played quarterback in my high school and loved it. I have some great memories of playing other sports in high school. I've got 2 young boys right now, and most days when I'm home, I'm some version of an Uber driver taking them to one sport or another. It's great. You build friendships, you learn how to fail, you learn how to succeed. Hopefully, as you move around to different teams and different sports, you learn how to build relationships and communicate, get access to different types of coaching. There's so many benefits to playing other sports beyond just being able to say, I played X and I played Y. There's dozens and dozens of developmental reasons to do it that aren't just physical.
Mm-hmm. So, Wags, let's assume for a second you had a son who was now 17 years old, right?
Sure.
And he's being recruited to go to college. And he's telling you, Dad, like, my dream is to go play pro ball.
Sure.
What's the advice you're giving him as far as like weighing both of those opportunities, whether it's college or the draft?
What are your opportunities going to look like in professional baseball? And this is typically where agents can come like really in hand for players. They can get a good pulse of all 30 teams. Hey, this is truly your interest level. You want to find actual feedback from 30 teams. I can give you my professional opinion that's probably going to include some amount of bias because you're my son. But I understand most families aren't in that position to have that type of expert opinion in the house. But gauge really what is that interest level? And based on that interest level, this is what that short term versus long term payoff is. And this is what college can offer you. If you really, really want to be a Major League Baseball player and you have the physical capacity to do so, there is no better way to learn baseball than to learn it at the professional level. You may take your lumps. You may have to spend extra time in the weight room. You may have to spend off seasons down there at the facility getting better and bigger and stronger. There's no better place to develop if baseball is truly the goal than in a professional environment because you get to dedicate 100% of the time to that. That comes at a different point for everybody. Sometimes you have to look at your kid and go, hey, you're not that good yet. You might be, but right now your skills don't translate really well to playing that fast at that speed. And those are tough conversations, but it's why you seek advice from a lot of people. It is one of the reasons I think it's beneficial for a kid to have an agent.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because I know I mentioned Dallas Braden, the interview earlier. He actually said something that was, I was almost proud of the scout that told him this. So he gets drafted in the 47th round by the Atlanta Braves out of high school. And the scout tells him, looks him in the eye. Now, I don't know how much you know about Dallas' story, but Dallas literally, like, his mom passed away in high school. He had no money. Like, they were beyond poor. And his scout's sitting in his living room telling him, like, you're not ready for this. And he goes, oh, I'm not ready to play professional baseball and you're going to pay me to do it? I don't care how much you have to pay me. Like, what else am I going to do? Like, I don't think you understand, like, my circumstances. And the guy says, look, I'm not telling you that you don't have the capability of turning yourself into somebody who could do this, but right now you're not mature enough. And he basically looks him in the eye and says, you need to, like, go to a junior college. And so he decides to go to American River Junior College. And then from there, Texas Tech. And it's not like he gets drafted high out of Texas Tech. He gets drafted in the 24th round. But he said it was like through all of these challenges where he eventually gets into pro ball. And it was like day one where he's looking at these other players and these other players who were just paid millions of dollars. He's like, I'm looking at them and I'm saying, all I got to do is get you out. You're paying me money to get these guys out. They have no idea where I come from. They have no idea how bad I want this. And so I love that you brought that up because it's like, just because you may choose to go to college first or you may choose to sign, no one's telling you that, like, you're not ever going to be good enough. You just may need to put some work in first.
Yeah, I mean, there was a right-handed pitcher from East Carolina that was available in the 2020 draft, didn't go in the first 5 rounds, and then boom, next year off the board in the first. Anybody could have taken him in 2020. Whether he was signable, I don't remember, but nobody did. He came back. He got into pro ball at the time he was supposed to get into pro ball, and he's had a pretty successful career to this point. That happens. Guys end up typically falling into professional baseball when they're ready to. That's when they go in. It's a pretty unique self-selection process, and scouts have to make some determination of, hey, he's really aggressive. He really wants to play. Not yet. I really like this player, though. And if he's going to sign regardless, then sign me up. I want to sign the talented kid, too. But it's understanding for each kid. And kudos to that scout for telling Dallas, like, hey, this is where I think you're at. Go to a junior college, get a little bit better, get a little bit more mature. Because so many people, more than likely in Dallas's orbit, were telling him how good he was. And somebody sat down across from him and said, you're really good, but you need to do this, this, and this, and you'll be better. And there's not enough people shooting somebody straight between the eyes with like real truth about where you're at, both physically and mentally. It's hard. Those are tough conversations.
Yeah, you mentioned the guy from East Carolina, and you said you weren't sure if he was signable. Help these people understand. I think that term gets thrown around a lot, and for those that don't know, like when you say signable, signability, what does that mean?
Sure, it's typically relative to your current talent level, what amount of money you would require in order to sign a professional contract or take whatever your other option is. So you can be incredibly talented and ask for a lot of money and be very signable. You can have average talent and ask for a lot of money and not be signable at all. There's times where you get off the phone and you go, wow, I can't believe how signable this player is. I value his talent here, and the number came in here. Both what you are and what you can be. That's where that like match has to be. And it's hard. It's a dance.
No, it certainly is. Yeah, because I think there are some times where maybe the kid has shown flashes of being somebody, but wasn't consistent enough, right? Maybe he was pitching a certain way, but couldn't go deep into games, right? By the time he got to the seventh inning, he was now throwing the low 90s, and yet he wanted to be treated like a guy who, let's just say, maintained the velocity deep into the game. There are many factors that obviously dictate that, but that's where I feel like sometimes there could be a miscommunication with somebody's value.
It's rarely that we're talking about the player's ability, like capacity, their high end differently, but we may be making very different judgments about how far away they are from that. Guys get paid typically because of two reasons. How high is their ceiling? How good can they be? And then how close are they to that? Because everything in between presents some amount of risk.
That's a great point. Yeah, you said that really well, which everybody listening, that makes perfect sense in the world, right? Like if you're somebody who's shown flashes of it one time in the summer and then the spring comes around and you're not that at all anymore, didn't matter that you did that 7-8 months ago. It's like, what have you been doing? Who are you? Because what people need to realize ultimately is like, yes, it's good that you had done it at one point, but what is our comfort level with believing that you're just going to show up as that guy the minute we sign you? And so, yeah, how much confidence are you giving us that this is actually who you are consistently every single day?
Yeah, I mean, we fill out scouting reports in terms of present and future tools. So, what do you currently have? What do you have a chance to do in the future? And that present grade is really what you own. What do I bank on you showing up, being able to do? So, if you've touched 95, you hear this as much as I do. Oh, there's a guy out at such and such high school throwing 95. You touched 95. You don't own a 95-mile-an-hour fastball. If you pitch at 90, 91, you currently own a below average fastball. You can touch 95, but you don't own 95. Your present grade is going to be that 90, 91. So when you say like, oh, I throw 95, there's a massive difference between somebody that can go out and pitch at 95 and somebody that will go out and just touch 95. And that present box is really, really what you own as a player. That's your current talent ability. Now, the 95 on the top end gives us some really good insight to what your top end capacity might look like as you get older and into better strength training and throwing programs. But there's still that gap between what you can be and where you are, and how much that gap is usually all of the difference in discussion.
Right. You mentioned the player's grade. Can you talk a little bit? And I know it depends on the position. And can you give us a sense of like, what are those grades? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so most teams use a scale of 20 to 80, and with 50 being average, 80 being Hall of Fame elite caliber tool, 20 being a tool that typically doesn't show up on a major league diamond, with the exception of rare circumstances. Most players are going to be floating between, as amateurs, some type of 40 and 50 type of tool set. I mean, maybe you run just as fast as the average major leaguer or even a touch better, but you don't throw quite at major league average. Or typically what we see in young hitters is they don't have major league average raw power yet, but they may have the capacity to get there. So our grade may look like a 40, which would be below average right now, and a future 50. We think you can get to average major league impact and power. And we go tool by tool with that, whether it's run, defense, hit, power, throw. We work through all of your tools and then try and line them up with your instincts and baseball IQ, and how do those two things kind of come together? Can you use your tools? Just because you have the physical capacity to have a tool doesn't mean you own it. Everybody knows the really fast guy that doesn't steal bases very well. So right now you have this raw tool that's really good, that's not quite lining up with the usefulness of that tool yet. And then we have to make a determination of how coachable are you? What's your desire to become a better base runner? All of those background questions lead us to a conclusion about whether or not you can close the gap to that tool.
Yeah. So at what point, Wags, do you guys start to communicate maybe with your player development department with a certain draft class? Like, are they at all involved in conversations before the draft?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and with all the organizations I've been with at this point, yeah, at some point you want another opinion on a pitcher's delivery, and you're going to send that over to a pitching coach in the minor leagues or a pitching coordinator, or you want the opinion on a swing. You think there may be a swing change that has to happen, and you're trying to figure out the difficulty of that swing change. So you may send it around through the minor league hitting coaches. Hey, have you dealt with this before? Have you had some success with changing this? Is this an easy fix or a long-term fix? Is it going to take 2 years for mastery, or are we going to knock this out by the end of instructional league? And so, yeah, you have to go right to the source that's going to actually be helping them with that. And they're a great tool. And, we've been really lucky. Our guys are excellent communicators and are pretty excited to help out. We also know that we need to be judicious with how we use their time, because they have a whole minor league system of players that they need to be coaching.
Well, and everybody listening, if you don't know this already, the Yankees are phenomenal at developing players. And if you've never watched the Rule 5 draft, every year you're going to see like the Yankees minor league system just continues to get decimated by guys getting taken in the Rule 5 draft.
It's a tough day typically for us.
Yeah.
Certainly the last 6 or 7 years, it's been rough. And I had a player I had signed when I was doing the area go to Boston, and it was like a dagger through the heart. It's like, oh man, I really wanted to keep that guy. So
well, and
I can root for him.
So many players don't even realize this. Oftentimes they think, oh, they didn't protect me on the 40-man roster. Have I fallen out of graces with them? And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, there's only so many spots, and oftentimes organizations have a tough job. It's like, okay, we like all of these guys, but who do we think has the best chance to be taken? Should we protect this player for that reason? Should we not? Whatever. And I had a kid who was, so this kid ended up getting injured. He was with the Cleveland. It was when they were the Indians. He was with the Cleveland Indians in Double-A. He gets taken first overall by the Oakland A's, right? And as you would imagine, kid gets taken in the big league phase of the Rule 5 draft, first overall. He's like, I'm a big leaguer. And I remember telling him even beforehand, I said, first off, we don't know if you're going to get taken, but just know this. If you don't get taken, I already had a conversation with Cleveland. Like, they love you. They hope that you do not get taken in the draft, right? He gets taken first overall, and I have a conversation. I said, all right, look, I've already told you this once. I'm going to remind you again. This does not mean you're guaranteed to be in the big leagues all year. You need to earn a job and make that team out of spring training. And let me show you how many guys have been in your shoes and have not made the team. Sure enough, he ends up going to big league camp halfway through, did not do well, ends up getting sent back to Cleveland. And just the mental challenge from that point forward of like, I'm back with Cleveland again. I should be in the big leagues. I mean, I don't want to say this was the reason why he didn't get to the big leagues, but it truly like threw him off course and he never could rebound from it.
Yeah, and it's tough because the information gets harder to get in the minor leagues, right? About what type of kid's going to be able to handle that kind of ping-ponging around the minor leagues in general, and being that close to the big leagues and not getting it the first time. It's where that makeup component, you hope continues to develop. We talk a lot about makeup not being stagnant. It changes over time. There are guys that were bad decision makers at 17 years old, and they come out of college and it's 3 or 4 years later, and they're great decision makers. They are super accountable. There's guys that we take, you're like, might lose some sleep over this one,
Right.
but he's going to be okay, I think. And 4 years later, you're like, man, he's grinding. He really loves this. He's really focused. And you're really proud of those players. You're excited for them, and typically at that point, you start banking on them having a decent career in the major leagues.
Yeah. So Wags, if you have a kid, let's say, well, I guess high school or college doesn't really matter. Kid gets drafted. When's the first time they should expect maybe some, I don't want to say criticism, but like a coach calling them over and saying, "Hey, we want to work with you on your swing or your mechanics on the mound a little bit." I've always told kids, because I think kids have it beaten to their head, like I'm going to show up day one and someone's going to come up to me and be like, "All right, hey, I know your arm slot's here. Let's go ahead and raise that up." I'm like, no, 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 no. They need to like spend some time with you and figure out like, does this work? Does it not? Which is ultimately a good thing for the player. So I've always told players like, I wouldn't expect really to hear much of any sort of, and again, the word that comes to mind is criticism, more like coaching, until they get to like instructs, right? In the fall.
Yes. Yeah. Typically, it's going to be instructional league. On the rare occasion that somebody's going to say something to you right out of the gate, it's typically going to be for injury prevention. You might not have done well on a movement screen when you showed up and you're showing like some extreme tightness in your hips. And they're saying, hey, we're actually going to shut you down from throwing or hitting or any kind of baseball activity to make sure that we can get you flexible and strong enough so that you can do the things at as high a level as we need you to do them. Injury prevention would typically be the only reason somebody would come in and do it like day one. So for the most part, it's instructional leagues. It's your off-season plan that you're going to get into, but it's just showing up as like day one, we're moving your arm, we're changing where your hands are in your swing. And they're going to let you play. There's a reason you got drafted, and players should generally be a little resistant if they walk through the door and day one somebody's like, "Hey, we're going to change you." If that were to happen without like a really solid explanation, I would typically tell players like, "Hey, you can push back a little bit. It is your career as well."
Yeah. The story I always tell people, and we talked about Austin Riley earlier. Austin Riley shows up to which I'll just remind people on the podcast listening. So Austin was a pitcher and a hitter in high school, and there were many teams that liked him as a pitcher and many teams that liked him as a hitter, as you would expect. And so he signs with the Braves, goes to the GCL, and goes like 0 for, I think it was like 0 for 26 with like 21 strikeouts. And his dad calls him on the phone and says, "Hey man, you sure that you chose the right path? You sure hitting was the way you needed to go?" And it was funny because I even told him at that point, I'm like, don't expect, like, no one's going to be tinkering with your swing. So like, that's normal. And he's like, I was wondering about that, because literally no one was saying like, "Hey man," like nobody was worried. And so it's a good reminder. Like if you could be Austin Riley, go 0 for 26 with 21 strikeouts to start your pro career, everything's going to be okay. You don't need to hit the panic button.
Yeah, you don't need to slam the panic button. Remember, there's a reason you're there, and if you can kind of have the confidence and the quiet confidence Austin had as a young kid, and you're as talented as Austin, like you got a chance to be okay. Like
Right.
it'll probably work out. But yeah, the idea that you're going to show up and people are going to start moving you and changing you right away is fairly far-fetched, with the exception of injury prevention, because you can't get better if you're hurt.
No, that makes perfect sense. Obviously, I don't think anybody wants any player to get hurt. So, yeah, naturally, if there's something that you're doing that they think is going to inevitably lead to that, thank them for bringing it up to you.
Yeah, attack it right away and make it a non-factor for your first full season.
Right, exactly. Wags, I've taken up a ton of your time. So I guess my last question is really wanting to hear from you. Is there anything that we did not touch on that you're like, these parents need to know this?
Only because I'm going through it with my own boys right now. And this is for like younger kids, when you're talking 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, as the tournament and travel style baseball picks up, be less enamored with like the team name and really do a good job making sure you know the person that's going to coach. There's organizations that may not have a great reputation at all, But in your age group, the coach is fantastic. He's wonderful. He's dedicated. He comes with practice plans. Have people show you practice plans. Make sure that the person asking you to pay a lot of money is going to show up prepared when he rents a field and brings you out there. There's organizations that have wonderful reputations and have turned out good players, and the coach at your age group may not be good. He may have an older team that's really talented, and the organization wanted him for that older team, but he's got a younger son as well, so he's coaching both. Do a good job of coach screening. Be a lot less enamored at the younger ages with what the organization name is on the chest, and really dig into like who's going to be coaching my kid, because the organization doesn't run a practice. Your coach runs a practice. The organization isn't coaching at third base and in the dugout in tournaments. Your coach is. Make sure that they have some investment in it as well. They're going to ask you to spend real money and real time getting into like youth competitive baseball, and you only have so much time and so much money to dedicate to it. Those hours need to be well spent, and your kid needs to be able to both enjoy it and get better. So really do a good job of like staying away from, hey, you may get lucky. There may be a great team name that you want to play for and land a great coach, and that's an ideal situation. But don't be afraid to ask coaches some really tough questions. The really good ones probably want it anyways.
Great advice. I think so many of these kids, especially with like social media and, oh, this is the team that's ranked, first in the nation. They must be good. They're going to turn me out, turn me into some superstar. It's like, yeah, when you're 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, fundamental baseball, learn it, spend time, in the cage, busting your butt, and it'll ultimately be much more fruitful in the long run. So that's great advice.
Yeah, and it'll be more fun. I mean, point
Yeah.
blank, you're 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. It should be a blast. You shouldn't be dreading going to the field. You should have an expectation that your coach is going to put together a practice that's going to help make you better, and doing it in a way where you're going to have a good time doing it. It's not that difficult.
So true. Well, Wags, thank you so much, man. This has been
thank you. This was great.
This has been awesome. I feel like these are kind of how our conversations go anyways, as we typically talk about this stuff. So I know that all my listeners are going to be grateful for just, you taking the time, you offering your advice. It's certainly going to be helpful for them. So thank you again, man. And we will be talking very soon, I'm sure.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Matt.
All right, Wags.